Chapter 16. Research, Development, and the Future. Psychological warfare is part of civilization. Civilization, no matter how one defines it, is not a static thing. It is an immense fermenting, active, often turbulent composite of the whys and hows of the way men and women think and behave. The short-run factors in a civilization are often as important as the long-run ones. Though the United States from 1860 to 1960 has been a steady part of the West European, predominantly Christian civilization, the United States has undergone immense changes of fashion, belief, appetite, preference, and behavior. With any changing, developing civilization, war may seem like a very static term, so that the Civil War and the War of the Western Powers against Germany of 1939 to 45 may to some degree seem comparable phenomena. They are comparable, but only within sharp limits. The meaning of war. Nowhere is the transitoriness and changeability of modern civilization more evident than in the significance which intelligent men and women attach to the term war. War was noble in 1861 to 65, but in 1941 to 45 it was noble only for the most perfunctory and most hollow oratory. Push the contrast farther, psychological warfare was an unknown element in 1861 to 65, by 1941 to 45. It had become fashionable. One can seriously doubt that President Lincoln ever worried about Northern citizens becoming un-American. Under that rubric, though he had plenty of traitors to worry him. The years 1945 to 53 were momentous. A whole string of new ideas, new terms, and new behavior patterns appeared within the USA in a mere 8 years. What the next 20 years will bring is deeply uncertain. War is coming to mean the effectuation or prevention of revolution, not the half-savage, half-courteous armed conflict of sovereign nations. War is getting to be chronic again. War between entirely comparable states such as the United States and Canada, Mexico and Cuba, Indonesia and India, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, or any similar combination, is getting to be more and more unthinkable. War between ideologically dissimilar states, such as North Korea and South Korea, Communist China and Nationalist China, Viet Minh and Vietnam, USSR and USA, is getting to be virtual normality. Research into tension. It is true of all people that they solve particular problems, in many cases, some time after the occasion for solving the problem has passed. What is called decision in government, politics, and in personal affairs is very often not the selection of one very real course of action as against another equally real course of action, but the confirmation of a commitment already made. If this is true of everyday life, it is even more true of scholars and experts. 1. Of the disabilities of our time in the field of the social and psychological sciences and the humanities lies in the fact that although government officials recognize problems some months or years after they have arisen, and finally attempt to deal with them, scholars frequently get around problems decades after any practical occasion for decision has passed. Nowhere is this more evident than in the discussion of tensions as a cause of war. Tensions certainly contributed very much to the outbreak of war in 1914. It is possible that the tensions and hostilities of Europe in the 1930s which allowed fascism and communism to become threatening and powerful also contributed in the end to the outbreak of war in 1939. It is difficult, however, to suppose that the coming of war in September 1939 was itself the result of tension except as a very remote and indirect cause. This author believes that tension leads to a perpetuation of a kind of civilization in which wars are possible, but cannot persuade himself that an additional factor of tension within civilization as we know it can be an immediate cause of war. Research into tensions has been carried fairly far. It may be that the wartime role of tension can be ascertained by scientific methods, so that the psychological warfare of power A can cause so much more tension than power B, either among the elite or among the general population. That power B cannot further continue the war. Alternatively, it is imaginable that power A may be able to relax tension so sharply among the elite or broad population of power B that power B's potentiality for war, or decision to wage war, can be postponed. For purposes of research, it seems worthwhile to suggest that tension appears to be highly prevalent in the two most powerful military civilizations on Earth today, the USSR and its satellites, on the one hand, and the cluster of Western powers on the other. Tension appears to be caused by the complexity of everyday life, the demands made upon the psychophysiological organization of each individual human being, by the technological facilities available, and through the relief offered within each civilization by the opportunity to discharge hatred against members of the other civilization instead of recognizing self-hatred for the very real problem which it is. In other terms, it is tough to be modern. The difficulty of being modern makes it easy for individuals to be restless and anxious. Restlessness and anxiety lead to fear, fear converts freely into hate, hate very easily takes on political form. Political hate assists in the creation of real threats such as the atomic bomb and guided missiles, which are not imaginary threats at all. The reality of the threats seems to confirm the reality of the hate which led to it, thus perpetuating a cycle of insecurity, fear, hate, armament, insecurity, fear, and on around the circle again and again. Revolutionary possibilities in psychology. It is possible, but by no means probable, that the rapid development of psychological and related sciences in the Western world may provide whole new answers to the threats which surround modern Americans, including the supreme answer of peace as an alternative to war or the secondary answer of victory in the event of war. Nothing in the existing academic literature on the subject of psychology of war, the psychiatry of modern mass behavior, the psychology or psychiatry of present-day power politics, justifies the inference that an applicable solution to our problems is at all near. The problems are almost all aspects of our entire lives, and one cannot solve life like a Delphic riddle or a single scientific experiment. It would be unwise of U.S. military and political leaders to overlook developing strengths within American everyday talk and thinking, whether academic or popular. Too specific a concentration on the problem of winning a war may cause a leader or his expert consultants to concentrate on solutions derived from past experience, therewith leading him to miss new and different solutions which might be offered by his own time. Changes need not always be thought of as weaknesses, which they are if past criteria are retained as absolute standards. Men born in the period 1910 to 20 may have endowments which are not commonly found among men born in the period 1930 to 40. Yet it is entirely possible that the generation born during 1930 to 40 may have capacities and resistances which the older generation does not altogether appreciate. Apply this concept to communism. Communism loses strength every day that it exists, each day deprives it of novelty, each day makes it a little more familiar, each day makes its leaders one day older. If Americans can learn how to be flexible and imaginative and to understand themselves as they really are, they might find that the real American appeal to the youth of the world would be much greater than the communist appeal. It was unfortunately characteristic of the United States in the early 1950s of the Cold War that U.S. propaganda was based on ideals and standards older than the ideals and standards competitively presented by the communists. And that therefore in many parts of the world the struggle between Americans and communists appeared to be a struggle on our side of the old against the young. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The United States Army in Korea in 1950–53 was one of the most revolutionary armies in history, an army dedicated to non-victory, pledging allegiance to a shadowy world government of the United Nations behind the practical reality of the government of the United States. Perhaps never before in many centuries have men fought so matter-of-factly, so calmly, so reasonably. They fought well and did not need to be jazzed up with the hashish of making the world safe for democracy, or establishing the four freedoms. The temper of the U.S. forces in Korea in 1951 was demonstrated by a reserve sergeant who scarcely knew he was in the reserves until he was on a boat bound for Busan. He was a practical man, anxious to get home, but willing to do his share in this war as long as he had to. He was given the assignment of testing the voice plane of U.S. headquarters at Taegu. The loudspeaker was not working quite right, and he was instructed to test the plane at 500, 1,000 and 1,500 feet. The plane flew low over U.S. headquarters. The roar of the engines almost deafened everyone within the building. Yet even above the roar of the engines there could be heard the bone-chilling hum of the silent loudspeaker, an immense magnification of the noise one hears from a radio set which is turned on without being tuned to a station. Everyone expected the sergeant to say, "This is the USAC voice plane testing, 1A, 2A, 3A. Instead the immense voice came through clearly, through brick, and plaster, and wood, through air and trees. It must have reached 4 miles. The gigantic voice of the sergeant seemed to roar over half of South Korea as he said, "Why, don't, you, imperialist, sons, oh, bitches, go, back, to, Wall Street, where, you, belong." It was said that 50 colonels grabbed for their phones simultaneously, but the purely American gimmick to the whole story lay in the fact that the sergeant was not punished. No damage was done. The Americans thought their enemies were funny or silly. We had shown that we were not afraid of communist ideas. Several South Koreans told the author that they regarded the Americans as inscrutable people indeed. The development of modern civilization is certain to have developments in war both as to the purpose of war and as to the modes of war. It seems likely that in the face of the supreme danger of atomic and thermonuclear weapons nations will resort more and more to small wars and semi-war operations which will offer the opportunity of strategic advantage without the cataclysmic danger of a worldwide showdown. In a very hush-hush way the U.S. Army is looking into the possibilities of small and irregular kinds of war. Security regulations prohibit the author from discussing some of the interesting new developments in this field. National Research and Development Programs. The United States government considered as a whole has developed a very adequate scientific research program. Most of this is quite properly keyed to the physical and mechanical sciences, in which the most tangible results are obtained. Substantial strides are being made in the medical and allied fields. Some research is, however, being carried out in fields pertaining to psychological warfare. These are worth describing, but it must be remembered that research on Psy-war may not affect Psy-war itself as much as research in other fields which, by changing the character of war, will change Psy-war too. Within the general research field, 2 basic approaches have been recognized by the U.S. Army as being distinct from one another: developmental research and operations research. Developmental research consists of that research which creates new weapons, new methods of war, new devices or procedures, doing so by digging through modern science, investigating its applicability to military problems, and then advancing the frontier of science, when necessary, in the military interest. The goals of operations research are more modest and, in some respect, more provocative. Operations research takes operations as they exist and re-examines them from beginning to end to discover how much of each operation is scientifically pertinent to its stated goal, what economies, modifications, or changes might be introduced, and how the operation might be improved. Developmental research in Psy-war. At the time of the close of the 1950-53 phase of Korean hostilities, the Psy-war being conducted by the United States Army in Korea showed little sign of having been influenced by developmental research into this field of activity. The leaflets were not better than the leaflets of World War II, nor even very different, because of the peculiar political limitations of the war. The radio program was not as good as the performance of ABSIE under Eisenhower. The tactical use of loudspeakers had shown a very marked improvement over World War II standards, but to a non-engineer such. As the present writer, neither the communist loudspeakers nor our own seemed strikingly better or different. Developmental research had a great deal to offer, but the gap between initial scientific advance and practical military application appeared to be too broad to warrant the assumption that the research had transformed the U.S. Psy-War program. Operations research in Korea. Operations research, sometimes slangily called OPSearch, was applied to the Korean War with highly uneven results. Among other things, Army officers in the Psy-War field showed, early in the Korean War, that land forces possessed tactical opportunities which combat propaganda could exploit very effectually. Various experiments were tried, none of them so decisive as to affect the outcome of the war, but some of them of real tactical value and others of great importance in obtaining Chinese prisoners. One of the points examined was surrender as a process. Surrendering does not depend upon the disposition of the individual enemy soldier to say yes or no to the war as a whole. He could say no 1,000 times and still be on the other side shooting at us. The actual physical process of surrender is an elaborate one consisting of the psychological processes of getting ready to give up on the other side, the physical capacity to surrender when the opportunity for getting captured presents itself, and the alternative, more difficult process of deliberately leaving the other side and getting to our side alive. In 1951 and 1952 there were considerable developments along this line. Americans learned much about how to teach enemy soldiers to surrender. Late in 1952 and early in 1953 the front had become so static that it took extraordinary heroism for soldiers, outside of a tiny minority engaged in reconnaissance patrols, to get away from their own side and surrender to the enemy without being killed by their friends as deserters or by the enemy as sneak attackers. The U.S. public did not realize that throughout the Korean War the Communists, Russian, North Korean, and Chinese, enjoyed a distinct radio advantage over the UN side both as to funds available for programs and as to number of station hours on the air. The language gap between the Americans and Chinese was so extreme that it was hard for Americans to realize that the Chinese broadcasts covered wider audiences and covered them better than did our own. American restraint in this field may have been dictated in part by the fact that the war was a limited war consisting of combat only with those armed Chinese communists on North Korean territory, but not with armed Chinese communists elsewhere in the Far East. Philosophy and propaganda development. In terms of specific literature of Psy-War it is difficult to find many contributions of professional philosophers to Psy-War since the end of World War II. This is curious, in view of the communist propagation of philosophy, no matter how perverted its form, as a major weapon. The American philosopher, Dr. George Morgan, who became a career diplomat, was simultaneously a Soviet-area expert and a key figure in the Psychological Strategy Board. There were not many others like him. Philosophy offers an opportunity for the re-examination of cultural values. The indoctrination of those professors who will teach the teachers of the generation after next will influence the capacity of future Americans to have a worldview which will give them the utmost opportunities for action in the military field while retaining as far as possible the blessings of U.S. civilian civilization. That U.S. civilization is still civilian and not military is, of course, beyond cavil. The William Jackson Committee was a voice crying in the wilderness when it asked for new terms and new ideas against which to set U.S. propaganda operations in the world of modern strategy. Philosophers may have had the capacity for finding some of the answers, but philosophers, of all people, do not like to be jostled or hurried. The author has never heard of a philosopher employed on a confidential basis by the United States government to think through the historical and cultural rationale of a U.S. military victory for the future. Writers such as F.S.C. Northrop and Erich Fromm, to name only two sharply contrasting personalities, have written books which possess high significance for the international propaganda field. The connection appears, however, to be tangential. Literary contributions. Almost all the best propagandists of almost all modern powers have been, to a greater or less degree, literary personalities. The artistic and cultural aspect of writing is readily converted to propaganda usage. Elmer Davis is a novelist as well as a commentator. Robert Sherwood is one of America's most distinguished playwrights. Benito Mussolini wrote a bad novel. Mao Zedong is a poet and philosopher, as well as a Communist Party boss. Down among the workers in the field, such American novelists as James Gould Cozzens, Pat Frank, Jerome Weidman, and Murray Dyer have worked on U.S. psychological warfare. Though literary men have converted their writing to propaganda purposes, few of them have gone on to define the characteristics of a specific conversionary literature or to compile canons of literary style applicable to the propaganda field. The contributions may lie in the future. The social sciences. The American Association of Public Opinion Research, AOPR, is the professional league of U.S. propagandists and analysts of public opinion. Its quarterly, Public Opinion, is the key journal in the field. The members of this association are drawn both from the social sciences and from the psychological sciences, ranging from such practical operatives as Dr. George Gallup and Elmo Roper to austere theorists like Professors Nathan Ladaes and Hadley Cantrell. A good argument can be presented to the effect that the skills brought from the social science into the propaganda field are more valuable once they are employed full-time in that field than an attempt to apply political science, or sociology, or economics, each as an individual compartment, to the field of propaganda. There is still no book available with the title The Politics of Knowledge, even though the reception, control, prohibition, and dissemination of knowledge is a major factor in all modern governmental processes both in and out of the propaganda field. Psychology and related sciences. There has been an immense amount of work done by psychologists, much of it classified, on the field of propaganda. Some of this work is refreshing in the extreme, and should provide nasty surprises for the communists in a major war. Other parts are restatements which if translated into operations might or might not prove feasible with the kind of army we Americans have, or are likely to have. One of the most conspicuous developments since World War II has been the application by psychologists, sociologists, and persons in related field of quantifying techniques. The introduction of rigorous scientific requirements of number into the attempted reportage of propaganda behavior or propaganda results is having a significant effect. Quantification may not obtain everything which its devotees claim for it. There is a wide area of human behavior which is significant to the ordinary person, or even to the expert in descriptive terms, and which loses much of its significance if the descriptive and elusive terms are replaced by measurements, tables, and graphs. There is, however, no danger that quantification will replace description as the sole tool of research in the propaganda field. What quantification does do is develop a common area of discussion between propagandists and non-propagandists. In many instances quantification can demonstrate results where allegations of failure or of success would have nothing more than personal authority to support them. Within our own particular kind of civilization quantification has a special appeal because of the American trust in engineering and in numbers. The conclusions of the Kinsey reports on men and on women seem much more authoritative to the ordinary man because they are presented with an ample garniture of numbers. Even though Havelock Ellis's pioneer works in the psychology and behavior patterns of Western sex life may have been much more tangible and much more revolutionary in their time. Projection and research. All propaganda involves a certain degree of projection. The propagandist attempts to identify himself with a situation which he does not face in real life and to issue meaningful communications to persons about situations which they themselves do not face yet. Much of the psychological research on tactical psy-war remains yet to be done, although from the quantitative point of view, There have been significant U.S. achievements within the past 4 years. Another aspect of projection is left unexplored because of its immense difficulty and its dangerously unscientific character. Consider the problem this way: the United States one day before the outbreak of war with a hypothetical enemy, such as the Soviet Union, will possess a certain group of characteristics. Representative individual lives within this country can be determined to possess certain habits concerning mass communication, trust in mass communication, and response to symbols which may come through press, radio, or other mass devices. One day after the outbreak of war, the United States will change because the war has broken out. 1 month after the outbreak of war, the United States will no longer be the USA 1 which existed on war day. It may well have become USA 25 because of the rapidity and variety of change. 3 Soviet hydrogen bombs and 12 Soviet atomic bombs might change many of our national, economic, political, and psychological characteristics, and no one, not even an American, could predict this change in advance. The best he could do would be to get ready to study the change as it occurred, to understand the rate and direction of the change, and to assess the meaning of the change in light of the conduct of war. The same would be true of the USSR. That country, like any other major country, would change under the impact of war. Who could have predicted the renaissance of Russian patriotism and traditionalism resulting from the Nazi invasion of 1941? Even if we know where the Russians are as of the outbreak of war, we won't know where they will head or how fast they will head there, once war has broken out. The scientific problem presented by attempted serious study of a U.S. Soviet war is therefore very difficult indeed. It is really a problem involving 3 clusters of moving bodies. The first cluster will be the American people, their behavior, and their institutions. The second cluster, the Russians and allied peoples, their behavior and their institutions. The third cluster, the changing methods of communication existing between them. It can be said even now, simply by referring to the character of the American people and their past history, that if the communist leaders of the USSR start a general war, the end of that war is sure, under sets of words and ideas which have yet to be developed in the future, to involve the reconciliation of the inhabitants of the USA with the Russian people. In other words, USAV and USSRV can and must have certain relationships with each other, preeminent among which are attempts at undoing war damage, at political and cultural reconciliation, and the undertaking of the rebuilding of a world which both these great peoples can support with enthusiasm and hope. USAV and USSRV are imaginable. USA-1 and USSR-1 for the day preceding the outbreak of war, or, alternatively, the day on which the war occurs, will be known elements. American science in many fields can help U.S. mass communications and therewith help our armed forces if we learn how to ascertain how the Soviet leadership changes, how Soviet elite groups change, and how the Soviet population changes during the course of the war. We must not only be able to guess what is happening to them physically, but must try to appreciate and to understand what is happening to them psychologically and semantically. This is an immense task. It is by no means certain that our research and development facilities can give us an adequate research program to handle the problem. This much can be said: if the Americans understand the Russians before the war and during the war, it will be the first time that a nation has kept its enemy in wide-awake sight. The usual process in the past has been the acceptance of a few exaggerated stereotypes of the national characteristics of the potential enemy, the ascription of every possible kind of infamy and inhuman characteristic to the enemy during the war, and the redefinition of the enemy as a friend after the war. It would be strange and wonderful if the U.S. government and the U.S. propagandists, or conceivably as much as a large minority of the U.S. population, could learn how to fight the USSR in order to help the Russians escape from a tyranny which has already hurt them much more than it has hurt us. The Germans suffered a tragic, overwhelming, and perhaps decisive psychological defeat in the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic and in the Ukraine, when they carried with their field forces such naive and tragic Nazi misconceptions of Russian and Ukrainian character as to defeat every opportunity they may have had for a serious anti-communist alliance of Germany with the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. They destroyed themselves not through ignorance, but through what they thought they knew. If they had been more calm, less assured, more willing to learn from immediate experience, and less indoctrinated with their own preposterous misconceptions of Russian and Ukrainian character, they might have found Russian and Ukrainian allies who would have joined them in the final extermination of the Soviet system. The world communist movement has already suffered very serious setbacks because of its failure to project U.S. behavior successfully from the summer of 1950 onward. If the Russian and Chinese communists had understood Americans well and had made a correct evaluation of the American response to the invasion of South Korea, they would not have driven the United States from lethargy to alertness. From weakness to military strength, from vulnerability toward communist and crypto-communist propaganda to sharp and angry recognition of communist manipulation of symbols such as progressives, people's governments, and liberation. Communist developments. If the U.S. government agencies know about the scientific development of Soviet propaganda techniques in the last few years, they have certainly not told this author. What is here presented is therefore derived from first-hand interrogation of communists, from escapers in both Europe and Asia, and unclassified materials. Sociologically, it would seem that the Russian communists attempted definite improvements of the techniques of communist revolution and that these improvements have in large part failed in the European satellites. The governments of Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany have turned out to be poor governments, despite the fact that from the Soviet point of view it was a sharp innovation to leave them in pseudo-parliamentary form instead of creating outright Soviet facsimiles. At the Chinese end of the Moscow-Peking axis, the sociology of revolutionary propaganda and organization appears to have worked out much more successfully than at the Russian end. The Chinese communists, perhaps because they were Chinese, perhaps because they were tougher and more experienced communists than the Russians, got their country under rigid control and then undertook social and political experiments on a very audacious scale. They have managed not to be un-Chinese while creating in China the kind of pervasive dictatorship which communist control appears to require. In the manipulation of satellites and in particularization of propaganda, the North Korean Communist Army, the Viet Minh Army in Indochina, and the Malayan Races Liberation Army on the Malay Peninsula appear to have near-optimum localism and particularism without suffering serious deviation from the main communist worldwide pattern. In North Korea, of course, Chinese intervention and Soviet support have sharply modified the position of the North Korean People's Army, but the Annamite and Malay communist forces appear to be fighting with high morale and considerable success. Despite the duality of control from Peking and Moscow, and despite the difficulties of reconciling Asian nationalism with Marxian world doctrine, another communist technique is now known through Edward Hunter's provocative pioneer book by its correct name of brainwashing. This involves the transformation of a human personality. The author has himself interrogated victims of brainwashing and can attest to the terrifying depth to which this process is carried. The victim of brainwashing is subject to very slight persuasion at the rational level. He is not even given much propaganda, as U.S. propagandists of recent years might recognize the product. Instead, the process of brainwashing consists of a frontal attack on all levels of the personality, from the most conscious to the most hidden. The communists seek through fatigue and sustained interrogation to create a condition similar to what is called nervous breakdown in popular parlance. Then they rebuild the personality, healing their victim into communist normality. One victim to whom the author talked had been so subject to communist brain changing that he thought himself a real communist even though he had been reared a Catholic. He was completely convinced of the communist cause and of his own life and place in that cause after the brainwashing had been completed. Unfortunately for communism, the man got into serious sexual difficulties of a kind which any American psychiatrist would recognize as potentially devastating. As a result of his sexual frustrations, he suffered a mild equivalent of the medically recognized phenomenon of the schizophrenic break, that terrible moment of false enlightenment in which the psychotic personality cuts loose with a truth of his own and shuts off most or all communication with normal people, with the consequence that he was walking along Nanking Road in Shanghai, A normal communist in one instant of time and, as he put it to the author, in a millionth of a second he suddenly realized he was a Catholic, an anti-communist, the enemy of every man, woman and child in sight, and at war with his entire environment. As this writer understood it, the poor man, though adjusted to the communist environment after brainwashing, happened to go crazy enough to come back to our side. Who can say which is sane, which insane? When two social and cultural systems are completely at odds with one another, it may be impossible to be normal in both of them. Scientifically, the Chinese process of personality transformation lacked some of the pharmaceutical features apparent in the Western communist conversions for purposes of confession. It appears to be a combination of audacious practical experimentation with well-known procedures from textbooks of Pavlovian psychology. It is, of course, an interesting scientific question to ask oneself: could communist psychological researchers do enough psychological research to understand their own difficulties and to decommunize themselves in the very act of seeking better psychological weapons for communism? If the people in charge of communist psychological techniques were scientists, as American psychologists generally are, there might be a real point of discussion. Unfortunately, most of them appear to be artists, believers, and fanatics. The history of the fanatical religions which have inflamed and ripped so much of mankind across the centuries is not such as to suggest that communism will decommunize itself by becoming more communistic or more scientific. Logically considered, the United States remains the largest extant revolutionary experiment in the world, the first immense human community which survives without profound dogma or profound hatred and which attempts to make short-range, practical, and warm-hearted, though ideologically superficial, concurrence the foundation for a political and industrial civilization. If the United States wins a few more wars, it may be that the rest of mankind will be persuaded that our kind of practicality is not only humanly preferable, but scientifically more defensible than the philosophies of competing civilizations. It seems unlikely that communist research can outstrip us in the propaganda field so far as the race is run in purely scientific terms. Artistically and gadget-wise, the communists are just as inventive as we are and often more enthusiastic. Private Psy-war and covert techniques. Another aspect in the development of Psy-war was the inevitable possibility that skills learned in wartime would not be forgotten in time of peace. Many of the background studies made for OWI during World War II have been developed, on the constructive side, into serious scientific contributions to ethnology, anthropology, or psychology. The post-war studies of RAND Corporation have in part been released in unclassified form, and add to our knowledge not only of propaganda but of mankind. The Radar Project at Stanford University, the Russian research program at MIT and Harvard, and other governmentally inspired or encouraged undertakings have borne similar fruit for private scholarship and discussion. On the other side of the coin, it is very hopeful to note that the many and dangerous techniques developed by OSS for covert propaganda, some of which were applied with considerable success in Europe, have not been introduced into domestic U.S. politics, commercial competition, or other forms of private life. After each war there is often a danger that the coarsening of a culture by the war will lead to the application of wartime skills to peacetime situations. This was emphatically not the case in the presidential campaigns of 1948 and 1952, even though persons of rich Psy-war experience in World War II were on the staffs of both Stevenson and Eisenhower. It is often forgotten that some of the deadliest and most effective revolutionary enterprises in the 19th century were undertaken without the consent or assistance of the existing governments. Karl Marx was certainly not an invention of Lord Palmerston. Bakunin did not operate out of the French Foreign Office. In the post-war discussion of U.S. communist rivalry, recommendations were often made on the U.S. side that we should counter Soviet covert operations with our own covert operations against the USSR. What has been forgotten in this context is the fact that such operations have been made illegal and dangerous under United States law. Under federal law as it exists today, no underground railway could be developed to assist Soviet escapers in the way that Negro slaves were relayed across the Free States to Canada in the years before emancipation. One of the chief blocks to U.S. covert operations is the immense growth in all directions of the power, authority, and responsibility of the federal government. This growth makes it almost impossible to wage revolutionary or conspiratorial operations from U.S. territory without the prior approval of U.S. authorities, which the authorities, under traditional international law, cannot give and cannot afford to give. It would seem desirable, if the Cold War situation persists over a long period of time, for Americans to re-examine the restraints which they have placed upon their own citizens and to attempt a revision of the laws which would permit pro-American secret activities to be launched without permitting anti-American activities of the same kind to be carried on. One immediately comes to the conundrum. How can the government say yes to the one and no to the other without being cognizant of what happens? The answer would appear to lie in the older body of our law, in that a withdrawal of governmental authority from some fields would leave the individual responsible and subject to indictment and trial if his enterprises should prove deleterious to the United States government, but not subject to punishment if his enterprises hurt the known antagonists of the USA. Phrased in another way, this means that the USA might, in a long-range Cold War situation, be required to make some domestic recognition of the fact that the communist states are the antagonists but not the military enemies of the U.S. system of government, and that as antagonists of this system of government such states, their representatives, their property, and their organizations should not be afforded any more protection under our laws than is given to the National City Bank of New York in the laws applicable to the City of Moscow, or the American Telephone and Telegraph Company in the laws which apply in Budapest. For a long time the communist states have treated even the most innocent business enterprise and social club on our side as though they were attainted with an inherent factor of criminal and subversive intent. The withdrawal of U.S. legal protection from all things communist might allow the American people, or those among them who so chose, to develop proclivities for adventure and troublemaking against the communists. These proclivities are now sternly repressed by federal statute. The future of psychological warfare. Psy-war has become an existing art, where it had no practitioners at all in the United States. Between 1919 and 1940, it has had a long and distinguished roster of active and reserve officers, civilian consultants, and demobilized veterans interested in the field ever since 1945. A wide variety of military establishments have had Psy-war responsibilities assigned them. Substantial cadres of officers and skilled enlisted personnel have been recruited and trained. Radio and leaflet facilities are ready to accompany our land, sea, and air forces wherever they may have to go. A U.S. strategic center for global propaganda, instantly convertible to wartime use, exists in the Operations Coordinating Board under the National Security Council. This is not the end of the story. One of the paradoxical but deeply true factors in the study and conduct of propaganda is this: the more people know about propaganda, the better they can resist it. Propaganda was a tremendous bogey in the 1920s. It probably seems very ugly and frightening to most people born before 1920. It does not seem too frightening, so far as the author can judge, to Americans born after 1930. Those born in the period 1920 to 30 appear to be divided in their emotional reactions to mass persuasion situations. Psy-war is not magic. It is a valuable auxiliary to modern warfare and a useful concomitant to modern strategy. If a particular strategic policy is sanely and effectively devised as a feasible deterrent to war, the Psy-war procedures supporting that strategy will contribute to the prevention of war. Psychological warfare represents a recognition and acceptance in the military and strategic field of skills which grow about us every day. Insofar as ultra-destructive weapons may have increased the tenseness and bad temper of people who must live under the perpetual but remote threat of atomic bombing, One can say that physicists have upset the nerves of mankind and that it is now up to the propagandists to reassure and to reconcile the peoples. Whatever Psy-war does, it certainly does not and should not increase the bitterness of war. Fighting itself is the supreme bitterness. Radio broadcasts and leaflets even in wartime only rarely should promote hatred. The situation which the world faces is dangerous because of technological development, not because of psychological knowledge. Psy-war ranks as a weapon, but it is almost certainly the most humane of all weapons. Apart from Psy-war, what military weapon destroys the enemy soldier's capacity to fight by saving his life? Psy-war tries to bring him over alive and tries to send him home as our friend. No rival weapon can do this. Psy-war, no matter what it may be called in the future, cannot be omitted from the arsenal of modern war. Neither can it outlast war. Its improvement is a cheap, valuable, and humane way of increasing the military potential of any country, whether we think that country to be politically right or politically wrong. Since 1945 we Americans have written more, studied more, and talked more about Psy-war than have any of the other free peoples. This is a hopeful sign. It can be read as an indication that the American love of the gadget, the American quest for a novelty, can be turned to the arena of the soul. The communists are better liars, better schemers, better murderers than we shall ever be. They start off by being better fanatics. Is it not in the American spirit that we should out-trick them, out-talk them, and outmaneuver them? We have a very creative and resourceful civilization at our backs. We have no Führer to guide us and no party line to comfort us, we don't even want such things. Hard though it may be, we can live with our own consciences and not seek for keepers. The communists have started a fight with us. That fight may go on a long time. If they want to stop fighting we shall certainly try to find peace with them. But if they push the fight to its bitter end, we shall not fail. Appendix. Military Psy-war Operations, 1950–53. On June 25, 1950, when the invasion of the Republic of Korea began, no real military Psy-war organization was tangibly evident. A planning staff headed by Colonel J. Woodall Green had been recreated in the Far East Command's GHQ in 1947, but it was hardly prepared to direct full-scale propaganda operations on such short notice, especially with a total lack of field operating units. Yet the staff with hasty augmentation did go into action, in effect, became its own operating unit, 2 days following the invasion, using both leaflets and radio in a strategic campaign that was continued without interruption for over 3 years. At the same time that General MacArthur made provision for the Psy-war planning staff in the Far East Command. The Department of the Army's G2 in 1947 directed the inauguration of a long-range program of extension courses to be administered primarily to the specialists of the Military Intelligence Reserve. One such specialty in the Military Intelligence Career Program was psychological warfare. Parallel with the development of training literature based on World War II experience, the Army experimented with the use of Psy-war in field maneuvers. A special unit, called the Tactical Information Detachment, was formed at Fort Riley, Kansas. Organization of Field Operational Units. Less than a month after the 1950 invasion, the Department of the Army announced the approval of a new organizational concept for Psy-war field operational units. The new concept, profiting by the organizational happenchance in all theaters of operations during World War II, established 2 functional units, one for strategic propaganda support, the other for tactical propaganda support, radio broadcasting and leaflet group. Although the concept for new unit organization and function was not conceived overnight. FEC's Psychological Warfare Section, PWS, with its dual planning and operating responsibilities pointed up the urgent need for a unit properly manned and equipped to support full-scale strategic operations in any area. So the Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet, R-Band L, group was born. Not only was it designed to conduct strategic propaganda in direct support of military operations, but it likewise was created to support the national worldwide propaganda effort when so directed. It was built on a basic framework of three companies: Headquarters and Headquarters Company, containing the command, administrative, supervisory and creative personnel necessary for propaganda operations. Reproduction Company, containing intricate equipment and skilled personnel capable of producing leaflets and newspapers of varying sizes and multiple color. Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company, designed to replace or augment other means of broadcasting radio propaganda. In 1953 a fourth type company was activated at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the Consolidation Company. This unit was very flexible and had the job of creating and conducting Psy-War in support of consolidation operations in areas under military government control. Figure 75, UN Propaganda. In some leaflets used in Korea, the United Nations emerged as a major point. Here UN lavishness to South Korea is contrasted with communist rapacity in the North. The scene does not remind the reader of slums on our side. Loudspeaker and Leaflet Company. The group's junior partner in the conduct of Psy-War support operations was the Loudspeaker and Leaflet Landel Company. This unit specifically supported an army in the field with adequate tactical propaganda support. Like the group, it supported the national propaganda objectives, but it interpreted the directives that came from the theater commander in terms of more immediate objectives. Its targets were smaller, lived under unusual circumstances, and presented highly vulnerable, rapidly changing propaganda opportunities, a real challenge for the Landel Company. Organizationally, it was a trimmed-down version of the group. Its company Headquarters and Propaganda Platoon were the offspring of Headquarters and Headquarters Company. The Publications Platoon was a smaller, more adaptable version of Reproduction Company. And the Loudspeaker Platoon was the tactical counterpart of the Strategic Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company. Figure 76, Korean Leaflet Bomb, Early Model. An M16A1 cluster adapter being loaded at the FEC printing plant in Yokohama, November 1, 1950. The bomb-type adapter will contain 22,500, 5x8, psychological warfare leaflets. The Tactical Information Detachment, moving from Fort Riley to Korea in the fall of 1950, was reorganized as the 1st Loudspeaker and Leaflet Company and, attached to USAC, served as 8th Army's tactical propaganda unit throughout the campaign. It adjusted its location, equipment and propaganda tone to keep pace with the ups and downs of the Korean War. Psychological Warfare Center. Paralleling the creation of the Office of the Chief of Psychological Warfare in the Department of the Army. Psy-War training was started in the spring of 1951. A faculty was collected at the Army General School to start the world's first formal School of Military Propaganda. At the same time, reserve officers whose civilian specialties were in or related to mass communications were recalled to Psy-War assignments. Several Arbandel groups and Landel companies were activated and trained at Fort Riley. One of these, the 1st Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet Group, was deployed to Japan to become the Strategic Propaganda Support Unit in FEC, thereby relieving the hard-pressed Psychological Warfare section of its operational functions. The group left Fort Riley in July 1951 at the height of the Missouri Valley floods, forcing the unit to take emergency detours by bus and train in order to meet its scheduled port of embarkation call. The 1st was the only group to have been used in active operations. Other groups were employed in training missions. In addition, reserve groups and companies trained periodically at key locations where sufficient specialized personnel were available to keep the units on a ready, standby basis. In April 1952, the Psy-War training activities at Fort Riley were moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the new Psychological Warfare Center was located. This center not only provided unit training supervision and facilities, but it fathered a new activity, the Psychological Warfare Board, designed to evaluate and test new Psy-War equipment and techniques. And the Psychological Warfare School, an outgrowth of the classes conducted by the Army General School, was formally recognized and established as one of the Army's specialist schools. More than 400 officers have received diplomas as Psy-War officers at the time of this writing, 1953. Most of the graduates have been Army officers, although successfully completing the course have been students from the Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, U.S. Information Agency, and from 9 allied nations. Psychological Warfare Staff, FEC. For nearly 2 years, the Psychological Warfare Section operated under the General Staff supervision of Intelligence, G2. Since World War I days, G2 had been given the responsibility for monitoring Psy-War activity, a practice that was evident throughout World War II. In 1947 the Department of the Army transferred the monitorship and supervision of Psy-War to Plans and Operations, G3. The shift was effected in FEC in 1952. Figure 77, UN Themes. This Korean language leaflet states, no soldier would attempt to fight 54 men. Yet Communist China is attempting to fight 54 nations. Don't fight for communist enslavement, join your comrades who have surrendered into safety. Early in 1953 PWS was transferred to the staff of the Commander, Army Forces Far East, AFFE, a paper transaction to put the staff in a closer position to coordinate the plans and operations of the supporting Army Psy-War units. Throughout the Korean conflict, PWS, like its area commander, wore 2 hats. PWS was also the Psy-War Operations Coordinating Agency for the United Nations Command. Broad objectives made possible throughout the war years the development of literally thousands of appropriate themes. One theme so prominent in World War II propaganda, that of unconditional surrender, was never used. UN policy denied its use, and PWS enforced the prohibition. Psychological Warfare Staff, USAC. Recognizing the need for Psy-War officers on Army and Corps staffs, the Department of the Army hastened to make an allocation for these officers to be integrated into headquarters structures. The Psy-War officers finally came to rest in the G3 Staff Section. 8th Army's Psy-War Division of G3 had the first loudspeaker and leaflet company under its operational control. USAC Psy-War officer kept a tight control over the propaganda output of the Landel Company by physically moving the propaganda platoon into his USAC staff office. Figure 78, Homefront Morale. When South Korean communications were interrupted, leaflets such as this provided an early boost to Korean civilian morale. Each of the Corps Psy-War officers had under his operational control 1 loudspeaker section, with a varying number of teams, from the Landel Company. Radio operations. Radio in the Korean conflict was used jointly as a strategic and a consolidation medium. From the beginning of the war, radio was the voice of our military policy. An ambitious network. Supervised in 1950-51 directly by PWS and thereafter by the 1st Arbandel Group, became known and recognized as the voice of the United Nations Command. The Korean Broadcasting System, KBS, and the Japan Broadcasting System, JBS, transmitted on a cooperative basis, with the U.S. government buying airtime. The 1st Arbandel Group's radio unit furnished programming assistance through key stations in Seoul, KBS, Taegu, KBS, Busan, KBS, and Tokyo, JBS. In addition, the group furnished technical assistance to KBS in order to keep as many as 12 network stations on the air. Leaflet operations. As in World War II, leaflets were delivered primarily by 2 means, aircraft and artillery. B-29s of the Far East. Air Force ferried leaflet bombs on night missions deep into strategic areas. Light bombers and liaison craft in support of USAC dropped both leaflet bombs and bundles on tactical targets. The leaflet bundle was a Korean War development. It was wrapped, tied, and fused in such a manner that it would open and release its leaflets in mid-air. The 105 mm howitzer remained the principal artillery piece for placing propaganda-loaded shells on pinpoint targets. Tremendous quantities of leaflets were printed. The first R-Band-L group on many occasions averaged better than 20 million pieces of printed propaganda every week. To this, the first Landl company in Korea added an average of 3.5 million leaflets per week. Loudspeaker operations. The airborne loudspeaker was the object of experimentation, but the bulk of loudspeaker broadcasts were made from vehicle mounts, such as tanks, and from emplacements. During the static battle situation of 1951–53, most of the broadcasts were of the latter kind. Range of the voice casts was short, something like 2,000 yards under ideal conditions. Personnel and equipment were supplied by the first Landl company, and scripts were prepared by Psywar Division, G3, USAC. Results of military Psywar operations. When the question was asked, just how effective was Psywar, the answer was vague. Clear-cut. Immediate evaluation of the effects of each propaganda campaign was often impossible to ascertain because of the many intangible conditions that were prevalent in the target area, conditions that were constantly changing. Some critics of the Psywar operations in the Far East Command charged that there were exaggerated claims of prisoners of war who surrendered as a result of propaganda. They pointed out that a head count of prisoners is an inaccurate measure of direct effects of Psywar used in support of military operations, because rarely is the taking of prisoners the sole goal of any major Psywar campaign. Other critics expressed the belief that emphasis had been placed on quantity rather than quality of propaganda. By quantity they meant propaganda measured by bookkeeping statistics. By quality they meant propaganda that, planned with potent intelligence, was capable of exploiting propaganda opportunities with maximum psychological impact. Did Psywar achieve its goal? The effects of planned persuasion in 1,000 days of radio broadcasts, in tens of thousands of loudspeaker appeals, in billions of leaflets, may be measured only in retrospect. The question may be answered when reaction in the target area has reached, or fails to reach, favorable proportion. Provided that the tangible results of the military operations can be clearly separated from those of concurrent and subsequent strategic international information operations. Figure 79, the famous airplane surrender leaflet. This is the controversial Far East Command leaflet that in April 1953 offered the sum of $50,000 to any pilot who delivers a modern, operational, combat-type jet aircraft in flyable condition to South Korea. The first pilot who delivers such a jet aircraft to the free world will receive an additional $50,000 bonus for his bravery. The leaflet was printed in 3 languages, Russian, Chinese and Korean. In this example of the Russian language leaflet, there are added notations in both Korean and Chinese that this is a message from the Americans to any jet pilot who can read Russian. If you know such a person, please give it to him. It tells him how to escape to the UN forces. Footnotes. Histories of warfare, of politics, though there are no good recent ones, Edward Jenks' little book being half a century out of date, of political theory, especially the excellent though dissimilar volumes by G. H. Sabine and by G. E. C. Catlin, of particular countries, of diplomacy, of religion, and even of literature all cast a certain amount of light on the subject. No writer known to the author specializes in the topic of historical propaganda. None takes up the long-established historical role of nonviolent persuasion in warfare. Some of the sociologists and anthropologists, such as Karl Mannheim, Max Weber, Talcott Parsons, Jeffrey Gorer, Ruth Benedict, to mention a few at random, have presented approaches which would justify re-evaluations of history in a way useful to propaganda students. But they have not yet persuaded the historians to do the work. 7 Judges 22-23. Leon Wieger, S. J., Textes historiques, Shin, 1929, Volume 1, pages 628-633. The author's attention to this reference was drawn by an unpublished undated typescript article in the War Department files by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel T. Mackle, INF. Lo Quan Chung, San Qua Chi Yenai, translated by C. H. Bruitt Taylor as San Qua or Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Shanghai, 1929, Volume 1. Recent writers on Genghis, such as Lamb, Vladimirtsev, Fox and Lattimore all credit the Mongols with a higher technological level of warfare than has been the custom among most Western historians. H. G. Wells' simple but compelling description of the Mongols in his Outline of History is worth rereading in this connection. Pettis de la Croix, The History of Genghis Khan the Great, First Emperor of the Antient Moguls and Tartars. London, 1722. Benedict Figken, Historia Fanaticorum, Danzig, 1664. Philip Davidson's Propaganda and the American Revolution, Chapel Hill, 1941, is a careful scholarly study of this period. Comparable studies have not yet been written concerning other American wars. Military and civilian historians have a fascinating piece of research awaiting them in the material concerning Confederate and Federal psychological warfare. Each participant in the Civil War was vulnerable to the propaganda of the other. Subversive and clandestine pro-Confederate propaganda in the North is outlined in George Fort Milton's engrossing Abraham Lincoln in the fifth column, New York and Washington, D.C. 1942, but no comparable study covering all forms of propaganda on either side is yet available. Various new editions of Paine's chief works are available in popular and inexpensive form. They are worth study as good propaganda. In his The Political Doctrines of Sun Yat-sen, Baltimore, 1937, page 17 and following, this author attempted to present some of the relationships of ideology to other methods of social control and, in connection with that enterprise, was furnished by the philosopher, A. O. Lovejoy, with a definition of ideology more systematic and more elaborate than the one used here. For example, in the 1920s the Soviet press expressed resentment and amusement over a ruse adopted by the British during the course of operations along the northwest frontier. Plane-mounted loudspeakers had told the tribesmen, in Pashto, that God was mad at them for having broken the pledged peace, with the result that they scattered and gave up. This maneuver exasperated the Russians, who themselves were making equally sweeping propaganda inroads on the other side of the Pamirs. The Russians were attacking religion, and having heavy going. It struck them as improper warfare to make use of local superstition. Webster's New International Dictionary, 2nd edition, Springfield, 1944. The late Huey Long is reported to have created a new word in the language of rustic Louisiana, the word damning newspapers. By instilling in his followers contempt for the capitalist press, he got them to the point where they disbelieved anything which they saw in print, and believed everything which old Huey, the kingfish, himself told them. This operation was technically competent, since one of the most effective means of putting propaganda across is to draw alarmed attention to unfriendly propaganda and then just happening to mention the truth, that is, the promoted side. Long attributed to the newspapers a large number of lies which they did not print, along with the lies, which were in historical fact true, that they did actually print. Since most of his followers either boycotted the press or read it in a hostile frame of mind, they never found out whether the newspapers said what Huey said they said, or not. You can try this out on your neighbors or friends by making up some idiotic quotation, such as, The Jewish Vorwärts says that pickled onions are a cause of immorality, or Le Temps of Paris says that Alaska is preparing to secede, and the listener will be so busy scoffing at what the paper allegedly said that he will take no time to find out whether the paper did say it or not. Such attributions occur in everyday life. The smart propagandist attributes plenty of rich, ripe, silly quotations to his opponent. How many people actually know what the communists have said on any given topic? Or bother to check on the actual claims of the Zionist organization? Or the statements of the Arabs in Palestine? The literature in this field is carefully described in 2 volumes by a 3-man team consisting of Harold D. Laswell, Ralph D. Casey and Bruce Lawn Smith, the first being Propaganda and Promotional Activities, an annotated bibliography, Minneapolis, 1935, and the sequel being Propaganda, Communication and Public Opinion, a comprehensive reference guide, Princeton, 1946. The book lists provide material in plenty for any academic-minded inquirer. The essays in the 2 volumes are well worth reading, although the authors have undergone the professorial delight of inventing a private language of their own. Parts of the latter book, especially, read like proceedings out of an unfamiliar lodge meeting, but there is sound sense and acute observation behind the vocabulary. It must, however, be parenthetically noted that during World War II the key propaganda jobs were held by a radio commentator, a dramatist, a newspaperman, a New York banker, and an absolutely astonishing number of men from commercial radio, along. Of course, with a sprinkling of Army and Navy officers in Washington, and a heavy majority of non-specialist officers in the field. The propaganda experts were not, in most instances, called in to do the actual chore of propaganda. Among the exceptions were Leonard W. Dubh, author of Propaganda, Its Psychology and Technique, New York, 1935, who served in the War Department's Psychological Warfare Branch and in the Washington Propaganda Center at OWI-C.H. Thompson, who served as a propaganda staff officer both in Washington and overseas after being a collaborator with the Laswell Group, and Drs. Edwin Guthrie and A. L. Edwards, whose chapter, Psychological Warfare, in E.G. Boring, editor, Psychology for the Fighting Man, Washington, 1943, pages 430 to 447, is a lucid epitome of the topic. This means that if you want to get baptized, you've got to get all the way under the water or it doesn't count. See Dubh's book, mentioned above, especially pages 71 through 89 and 413 through 417. See the bibliographies by Harold Laswell and others, mentioned above, for a wealth of literature giving more technical and scientific breakdowns than this. The formula STASM represents what was actually used in preparation of up-to-the-minute propaganda spot analysis for the War Department General Staff by Propaganda Branch during World War II. Some further aspects of this formula are presented in my article, STASM, Psychological Warfare and Literary Criticism, in the South Atlantic Quarterly, Volume 46, Number 3, July 1947, pages 344 to 348. See Harold Laswell's Propaganda Technique in the World War, New York, reissue 1938, Chapter 2, Propaganda Organization, for a description of the attempts to coordinate policy and propaganda in World War I. Chicago, 1946. The discussion of what censorship authorities regarded as propaganda material possessing value for the enemy, of the wartime OCOWI relationship, and of censorship of shortwave broadcasts are of particular interest to the student of psychological warfare. In a somewhat different context, it is interesting to note that Chinese Protestant churches, made up of Chinese church members, like to hire ministers who mouth their Chinese with a strong American accent. The American missionaries established the American accent as part of the liturgical paraphernalia of Protestantism, and the Chinese preachers trained under them accepted the American mispronouncing of Chinese as a part of the religion. It is odd to see a church full of Chinese using absolutely unbelievable tones while singing hymns or making appropriate individual responses. At that, they are no funnier than the Chinese Buddhists, who memorize long Indian sutras without understanding a single syllable. On World War I, see Harold Laswell's Propaganda Technique in the World War, previously cited. George Creel's How We Advertised America, New York and London, 1920, the very title of which is an indication of its chief shortcoming, Lieutenant Colonel W. Nikolai, Nachrichtendienst, Presse und Volksstimmung im Weltkrieg, Berlin, 1920, by the German General Staff Officer chiefly responsible for staff work on propaganda and public opinion, a very thoughtful though prejudiced book. Heber Blankenhorn's enjoyable little classic, Adventures in Propaganda, Boston, 1919, Blankenhorn was the only American officer to see field service in propaganda in both wars, as a captain in I and a lieutenant colonel in II, and George G. Brunt's scholarly monograph Allied Propaganda and the Collapse of the German Empire in 1918, Stanford, 1938. Readers desiring further references should consult the bibliographies by Laswell, Casey and Smith, cited above. Colonel Nikolai, book cited in footnote 1, pages 160 to 161. For a pro-Hitler view of the world, see Wyndham Lewis Hitler, London, 1931, if a copy is to be found. The author would probably prefer for the book to disappear. It is an eloquent, very pro-Nazi book, putting the Hitlerite terminology into the English language and, what is more important, infusing into the clumsy German pattern of thinking and feeling a lightness of touch which makes Nazism more palatable. The book converted no one in its time, and is not apt to do harm at this late date. But it will make the English reading reader understand some of the novelty, the revolutionary freshness, the bold unorthodoxy which made millions of people turn to Hitlerism as an escape from the humdrum heartbreak of Weimar Germany. Much of the book is devoted to the problem of power, street fighting, mass demonstrations, slogans, symbolisms, which so fascinated the Nazis. See Carl J. Friedrich, The New Belief in the Common Man, Brattleboro, Vermont, 1945, Chapter 3, Independence of Thought and Propaganda, pages 81 to 120, for a cogent discussion of this mentality. The present author, In Government in Republican China, New York, 1938, pp. 18 to 23, describes in epitome the method whereby the ancient Confucian leadership of China, while propaganda-conscious, used ideology as an economical, stable method of control and avoided its maleficent features. In one of the few poorly argued passages of a great work, Arnold J. Toynbee overlooks this peculiar characteristic of Confucianism and merely equates the Confucian dogma with those of other, universal churches, A Study of History, London, 1939, Volume 5, especially pages 654 to 5. People's Commissariat of Justice of the USSR, Report of Court Proceedings in the Case of the Anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center, Verbatim Report, Moscow, 1937, page 111. These trials were themselves propaganda. In this particular instance, propaganda of a rather poor order, since they failed to convince the foreign public and presumably persuaded only those portions of the Russian public who were so gullible that they needed no further persuading. For a brilliant illumination of them in terms of a readable novel, see Arthur Koestler, Darkness at Noon, New York, 1941. The same author also has a book of essays on the totalitarian mentality under the rather fancy title, The Yogi and the Commissar, New York, 1945. On the same subject, see Louis Fisher's Men and Politics, New York, 1942. This document establishing the COI, along with the other major documents pertaining to American psychological warfare, may be found in J. P. Warburg's book cited above, Unwritten Treaty. In the course of a routine day of work on overseas propaganda in 1942, the author, who was then in SSG of MIS, found it necessary to get in touch with military intelligence proper, naval intelligence, the State Department. The Office of the Assistant to the President, the Office of Facts and Figures, the British Political Warfare Group, which was vainly seeking its American opposite number, the Office of Civilian Defense. The Research and Analysis Branch of the Office of the Coordinator of Information, the Office of the Librarian of Congress, the Foreign Information Service, and the Department of Agriculture. Each of these either operated propaganda, or had policy or intelligence contributions to make. The Board of Economic Warfare naturally came into the field too. This was during a period of German and Japanese victories, so that even if propaganda had been coordinated, it probably would not have been much more effective than it was. From what could be figured out later, no real harm was done at this time. Nor was much achieved. The bibliographies are cited above, on page. The journal comes out, as its title indicates, 4 times a year. It is published by the School of Public and International Affairs, Princeton University, Princeton, N.J. Every major library has it. The review section provides a good survey of new writing in the field. Journals such as the American Political Science Review, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the Infantry Journal, and the American Historical Review often have significant articles or book reviews in this field. International Affairs, Royal Institute for International Affairs, London, has excellent reviews of books arranged by geographic subheads. Opinion and propaganda topics are usually lumped together in academic studies. Material on the one is apt to lead to the other. San Tzu Ching, translated and annotated by Herbert A. Giles, Shanghai, 1910, pages 2 and 3. The translation quoted is not by Giles. On the transmitting side, nothing could be more ruinous than mere translation, the more literal the worse, of a single basic broadcast for all audiences irrespective of language or culture. For the text of war communiques or of official documents, this is permissible, but for news or feature broadcasts, few things could be worse. It is not possible to translate subtle psychological appeals embedded in news or commentary. Such materials by their nature must follow forms acceptable to the audience, building up confidence with familiar allusions and creating a sense of we-ness between the actual announcer and his listeners. Equivalence can be worked out. The same basic policies can be transposed. The same source of news and intelligence can be exploited. But the actual program cannot be translated verbatim from one language to another. It must be transposed not only from one language but from one culture to another. Free advertisement. Bad news about his side is not necessarily the only kind of bad news for the enemy to know. Gloomy news about our side can harm the enemy listener if his government is running a propaganda campaign to raise production, promote thrift, etc., by claiming things are worse on their side. In such a case, good news about us would be good for him. News must be fitted to the propaganda plan and to the propaganda situation. Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, was first published in New York in 1922, but it is still clean-cut as a basic statement of the problems of public opinion. The author's own life as a commentator is remarkable in fulfilling the mission which he implicitly set himself when writing about public opinion, the job of lifting issues into emotional and psychological contexts in which the resulting judgment will be based on socially sound factors. The American newspapers between 1942 and 1945 carried intermittent accounts of these personal and political problems, frequently in the columns of commentators rather than in the regular news sections. The book by Warburg is of course unwritten treaty, mentioned above. For popular histories of the OSS, see sub rosa, the OSS. An American Espionage by Stuart Alsop and Thomas Braden, New York, 1946, or Corey Ford and Alastair McBain, Cloak and Dagger, New York 1946. An exciting thriller novel by Darwin Thielhet gives an oblique and guarded description of black propaganda and clandestine polling, The Fear Makers, New York, 1945, Thielhet was himself in OSS. For an interesting description of OSS field operations, see Nicholas Smith's Into Siam, New York, 1946. OSS was picturesque from the very start, and it is likely that other participants in OSS work will from time to time bring out books on their adventures. Bureau of the Budget, United States Government Manual, 1946, first edition, Washington, 1946, says of the Military Intelligence Division, it has charge of propaganda and psychological warfare, page 198. The fiat may be a little more precise than circumstances warrant, but it at least shows where, for the record, psychological warfare belonged. See Charles E. Merriam's study, Political Power, Chicago, 1933, and his later works for suggestive approaches to the political setting of propaganda problems. He developed the terms Miranda and credenda for modern political science usage. While this statement is plainly a matter of individual opinion, the author considers that his own experience supports his opinion in this instance. He wrote plans on almost every operating level in the governmental and military hierarchy during World War II. All the way from drafting plans for the joint, American, and combined, British-American, chiefs of staff down to helping field agents in the China theater work out practical little propaganda plans for their own missions, or planning the writing, use, and classification of leaflets one by one, in collaboration with OWI operators. He found planning to be fascinating at the top, and worthwhile at the bottom of the pyramid, but he found no significant correlation between the top and the bottom, save in the sense which he makes plain. In the pseudo-technical propaganda slang of the OWI people, this was called spelling out. The same people stockpiled campaigns to needle the enemy. So far as he knows, the author was the first, about May of 1942, to urge that a surrender pass be made to look like an official document, with banknote type engraving and with formal style. Unfortunately, it was printed in green, instead of the old-fashioned orange-gold of the U.S. Treasury yellowbacks, and was sent to the jungle areas of the South and Southwest Pacific, where everything was green to start with. These suggestions are based on the comment of Major Martin Hers, who prepared the leaflets at Anzio Beachhead and subsequently was leaflet expert at SHAF. No author, publisher, place or date. Issued by the unit. The reference is to page 55. The Department of the Army is understood to be preparing a field manual and technical manual for psychological warfare which will describe the doctrines and the equipment, respectively, to be used in combat propaganda situations. In the post-war period a great many reflective publications began to appraise what had happened in the Psy-war field. One of the best of these is Daniel Lerner's Psych-War, Psychological Warfare Against Germany, D-Day to V-Day, New York, 1949, which covers the European operation in detail. This was followed by Propaganda in War and Crisis, edited by Daniel Lerner, New York, 1951. A heavier work, covering many of the same problems is The Language of Politics, by Harold D. Laswell, Nathan Lades and Associates, New York, 1949. Leonard Dub's work on propaganda, long the leading American text in the field, was issued in a revised, post-war edition, New York, 1948. The post-war book does much to put psychological warfare in perspective. A simpler text than Dub's, useful for less advanced students, is Frederick C. Irian's Public Opinion and Propaganda, New York, 1950. A manual directly pertaining to psychological warfare is America's Weapons of Psychological Warfare edited by Robert E. Summers, New York, 1951. This also contains a bibliography which is helpful to the layman. Three outstanding works summarize the post-war propaganda position of the U.S. government. Charles A. H. Thompson's Overseas Information Service of the United States Government, Washington, 1950, shows the continuity of the problem from war to peace. Wallace Carroll's Persuade or Perish, Boston, 1948, argues the necessity of maintaining an opinion offensive, and Edward Barrett's illuminating discussion, Truth is Our Weapon, New York, 1953, brings the story down to the Eisenhower administration. New insights into the nature of the Soviet antagonist were presented by three related monographs originally prepared inside RAND Corporation, the research facility which often works with the U.S. Air Force. Nathan Lades, The Operational Code of the Politburo, New York, 1951, digests Soviet fundamentals of international behavior. Margaret Mead's Soviet Attitudes Toward Authority, New York, 1951, applies anthropological and psychiatric methods of analysis. This book, to the military or general reader, should be prefaced by reading her distinguished work, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, which is now available in an inexpensive, paper-bound reprint, Mentor Books, New York, 1952. Philip Selznick makes the point that organization is itself a communist power-achieving instrument in his The Organizational Weapon, New York, 1952, the third of the RAND Group. Lieutenant Colonel William R. Kintner, a regular Army officer, prepared the challenging study of the specific military content of communist thinking in The Front is Everywhere, Norman, Oklahoma, 1950. Among the many good recent books about the Communist Challenge, R.N. Carew Hunt, The Theory and Practice of Communism, New York, 1951, is outstanding for its dispassionateness, while James Burnham's The Coming Defeat of Communism, New York, 1951, is a ringing appeal to our side to meet the challenge. Stephen T. Pawsony, In a Century of Conflict, Chicago, 1953, presents the most coldly damning and most far-ranging critique of communist operations which this writer has seen. Wilmoor Kendall rendered Americans a service with his careful translation, editing and introduction of A. Rossi, A Communist Party in Action, New Haven, 1949, while Bob Dark, in a British counterpart, gives a less intellectual and much abbreviated description of the British communist setup and operations in the communist technique in Britain, London. 1952. Communist Revelations of Capitalist Conspiracies which tell more about the haunted, anxious, nasty minds of the communists than about our own operations are, among others, L. Natarajan, American Shadow over India, Bombay, 1952, and Jean Cathla, They Are Betraying Peace, Moscow, 1951. Paul M. A. Linebarger, Communism as a Competing Civilization in Southeast Asia, A Contribution to Southeast Asia in the Coming World, Philip W. Ayer, Editor, Baltimore, 1952. For a contrary point of view, see the works by Harry Stack Sullivan, Brock Chisholm, and others. Problematical in all such attempts of working officers to define victory is the serious intellectual issue of avoiding means which by themselves defeat the ends which are sought. If the means are dangerous or immoral, by the standards of the society which applies them, their value becomes low indeed. For the covert side of U.S. operations, see the breezy and popular volumes on OSS, Lieutenant Colonel Corey Ford and Major Alastair McBain, Cloak and Dagger, The Secret Story of OSS, New York, 1946, Stuart Alsop and Thomas Braden, Sub Rosa, The OSS and American Espionage, New York, 1946. And the most vividly concrete narration of the group, Elizabeth P. MacDonald, Undercover Girl, New York, 1947. For an astonishing work which seems to violate security on every page, see Commander Roy Olin Stratton, Sacco, The Rice Paddy Navy, Pleasantville, N.Y., 1950. This is the description of a Navy group in China which the author shows to be more covert than OSS itself. A dry, German view of Anglo-American espionage in Holland is given in that superb, true-life adventure story, H.J. Gisk's London Calling North Pole, London and New York, 1953. See the works of Frida Utley, Herbert Fays, the Linebarger Jangberg's political science text, New York, 1954, and others, not to mention the contributions by Mao, Liu Shaoxihi, and other communist leaders. The author himself pleads guilty to having criticized the French unduly without accepting a reasonable share of U.S. responsibility for the situation in Indochina, Paul M. A. Linebarger, Indochina, The Bleeding War, Combat Forces Journal, March 1951, and was deservedly rebuked from some French readers for his denigration of French imperialism. The author cannot endorse as wise, shrewd, or kind the French political decisions in Indochina, but he can say that the Americans who made, or failed to make, basic policy concerning that area have been as irresponsible and foolish as the French. He trusts that, by the time this note reaches print, a more effectual Franco-American understanding will have replaced the previous difficulties. Psychological warfare is, of course, neither very psychological nor is it necessarily warfare. Indeed, within the context of a rigidly purist and scholastic definition, psychological warfare is not psychological, in that most of its operations are very definitely not a part of present-day scientific psychology. Neither is it warfare because it can be operated before war, during war, after war, or contemporaneously with and apart from war. As pointed out above, war involves the inescapable content of public lawful violence. It is hard to ascribe violence to a shortwave broadcast or to a leaflet. In Korea in 1951, the author heard that a Chinese soldier was found dead, mashed by a leaflet bomb which had failed to explode at the proper altitude. If this story is true, that particular soldier was one of the few genuine war victims of military or strategic propaganda, both so pretentiously called psychological warfare, by Americans of the mid-20th century. Anthony Laviero, who summarized American Psy-War in the New York Times in a series of articles between December 9 and December 14, 1951, is both an experienced general staff officer and a first-class newspaperman. His comment in 1953 on the new Operations Coordinating Board was encouraging or ominous. He stated in his Times dispatch of September 4, 1953, that the William Jackson Committee had found that psychological warfare did not exist as such. If this meant that the new OCB was to sweep aside the limitations of top-secret pedantic definitions and move toward a refreshingly concrete manipulation of the world scene, the news was encouraging indeed. If the new board was, however, to be dedicated to the manufacture of new, complicated and secret definitions of its own, the news was bad. Given the time lag on the declassification of government materials, it may be 25 years, or 1978, before the precise definitions of 1953 are available to the public. The tendency of the board to succeed or to fail will be evident by the time this material is in print. Given the personalities involved, the prognosis appeared optimistic. This kind of issue has not been neglected in our public discussions or our schools. Two sides of one famous case are given in Owen Lattimore, Ordeal by Slander, New York, 1951, and the bitterly anti-Lattimore book by John T. Flynn, The Lattimore Story, New York, 1953. A serious intelligent attempt to answer some of the problems posed by Psy-War and the resulting loyalty issues within a democracy are the works of Nathaniel Whale, Treason, The Story of Disloyalty and Betrayal in American History, Washington, 1950. And The Battle Against Disloyalty, New York, 1951. A formidable presentation of what the communists are doing is offered in Ralph de Toledano, Spies, Dupes, and Diplomats, New York and Boston, 1952, and in Major General Charles Willoughby, Shanghai Conspiracy, New York, 1952. The kind of roundtable often intellectually conceived and executed within American schools is well portrayed in the special issue of Columbia Journal of International Affairs, New York, Spring, 1951. In which the entire issue is given to a synthesis of international problems in the propaganda field under the heading, Propaganda and World Politics. Stephen Posseny's Magistral A Century of Conflict, Chicago, 1953, provides an excellent general framework. Nothing in previous U.S. experience prepared Americans for the invasion of the individual personality which has long been accomplished by the communists but which was first publicized in adequate fashion after the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. The pioneer book in this field, and still the best, is Edward Hunter's Brainwashing in Red China, New York, 1951. This author has known Mr. Hunter for 20-odd years and can vouch for him as a man with a sober respect for fact. Though he does have a vivid taste in adjectives, he has seen not only Mr. Hunter but has gone over some of the raw material which Hunter used and can testify to the reality and sympathy with which Hunter portrays this rather gruesome process. On a different scale, Wilbur Schramm has given a description of what happens when the Reds take a city, New Brunswick, 1951, in a book of that name written jointly with John W. Riley. A sharp contrast between the old politics and the new is shown by the unfortunate book prepared in the Department of State and now hastily, even guiltily, allowed to go out of print by the United States Government Printing Office because it showed that some Americans were guilty or naive enough to try to love and trust the Soviet state within the same system as our own. One does not know whether to laugh or to weep at the spectacle of men lamenting the fact that they were once innocent and hopeful. The book, prepared by the late Harley Notter and others, is Department of State Publication 3580, General Policy Series 15, Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation, Washington, 1949. That not all was innocence, even when things so seemed, is amply attested by Frida Utley's controversial but brilliant summary, The China Story, Chicago, 1951. The function of decision-making has been brilliantly though solemnly explored in Richard C. Snyder, H. W. Bruck and Burton Sapin, Decision-Making as an Approach to the Study of International Politics, Princeton, New Jersey, 1954. For a contrary point of view, see Tensions That Lead to War, edited by Hadley Cantrill, Princeton, 1950. The author had the opportunity of observing OPSEARCH in the Korean War on 3 different occasions, September 1950, March 1951, and November and December 1952 and early January 1953. He visited Korea itself twice and also spent a great deal of time, part of it in a public capacity and part of it as a freelance author, in the periphery of that war, areas such as Hong Kong, Indochina, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, and India. Several novels have touched on Psy-War problems. The most hard-hitting of the lot is Jerome Weidman, Too Early to Tell, New York, 1946. Covert Psy-War whispering techniques are thinly disguised and much improved, technically, in Darwin Thielhet, The Fear-Makers, New York, various dates. The covert side of some of these adventures is portrayed, among others, by W. Stanley Moss, A War of Shadows, New York, 1952, Ray Franklin Kaufman, The Coconut Wireless, New York, 1948, and Chin Ki-an, Silent Army, New York, 1953. As exciting as fiction are Mark Gain and John Caldwell, American Agent, New York, 1947, describing the work of an enthusiastic amateur, and L. C. Moisish, Operation Cicero, New York reprint, 1952, portraying a first-class professional. Alexander Foote, Handbook for Spies, London, 1949, and J. V. Davidson Houston, Armed Pilgrimage, London 1949, are interesting distillations of personal experience which touch on espionage and Psy-War. The author professes he would like to write a preliminary work on this subject himself someday, if no one else essays the task first. V = Victory Day. Edward Hunter, Brainwashing in Red China, New York, 1951. If one good book can be mentioned without prejudice to the many other good books in the same field, attention can be drawn to the excellent undergraduate text which explores the present U.S. position on the press, George I, Bird and Frederick E. Merwin, The Press and Society, New York, 1951. At the opposite end of the spectrum, see Oleg Anisimov, The Ultimate Weapon, New York, 1953. The first book takes the U.S. as it is and does not envisage profound responses coming as the inevitable accompaniment of frightful change. The second book states the outside problem in shocking terms, but asks of Americans things which neither they nor their press are ever apt to approve. The development of this activity was handed to the Chief of Army Field Forces, in whose G2 section Colonel Donald Hall was the Psy-War officer. The first of these courses with its supporting textbook was not ready for release by the Army General School until 1949, just 1 year before the Korean conflict began. In 1949 likewise appeared the first officially approved Army Field Manual on the subject of psychological warfare support of military operations. Teams from this detachment, armed with leaflets and loudspeakers, were sent to and participated in major maneuvers in continental United States, in the Caribbean area, and in Hawaii. These teams were attached to the enemy forces, and exposed the maneuver troops to military propaganda in action. The Tactical Information Detachment suddenly suspended its planning of simulated propaganda operations for Exercise Pluto in 1950. As the only Psy-War operational unit in the Army, the detachment was hustled off to Korea. Index. Abbeville. Adams, Samuel. Adipati. Aggression, timing. Aims, long range. Air dropping. Air rescue. Air support. Aircraft, World War I. Allen, George. Alsop, Joseph. Alsop, Stuart. American Association of Public Opinion Research. American Broadcasting Station in Europe. American Expeditionary Forces. See also Pershing's Headquarters. American Operations, Effects. American Policy in Indochina. American Revolution. Black Leaflet. American-Russian Meeting. Anderson, Hans Christian. Anger Motif. Annamites. Announcers, Radio. Anti-communist appeals. Anti-Semitic propaganda. ANZIO. Appeals, Black Action. Armed Forces Radio Service. Armed Forces Radio Stations. Army Air Forces. Army Forces, Far East. Army General School. Aryan Myth. Aryan Racialism. Asia. Communism in. Athenians. Atrocities. Attu. Audience. Austria. Azad Hind. Azad Hind Fauj. Aztecs. Bakunin, Mikhail. Balkan States. Balloons. Barrett, Edward W. Bataan. Beaverbrook, Lord. Belgium. Belly Tank. Benedict, Ruth. Bengal. Benton, William. Black Counterpropaganda. Black, Lieutenant Colonel Percy. Black Propaganda. Blaine, James G. Blankenhorn, Heber. Boers. Bolshevik. Bombs. Leaflet bombs. VL. V2. Bonus Troubles. Book that won the war. Bose, Subhas Chandra. Boxes, Packing. Braden, Thomas. Brainwashing, FF. Breakdown of propaganda items. Brest-Litovsk. Brewitt Taylor, C. H. Britain in 1940. British. British Admiralty. British Broadcasting Company. British Foreign Office. British in Indochina. British Psychological Warfare. British War Office. Brogan, Dennis W. Brown, Don. Bras Tito, Josip. Bruntz, George G. Buchan, John. Bulgaria. Bullock, General William. Burden, Captain J. A. Burma. See also North Burma. Buttles, Lieutenant Colonel. Bruce. Byelorusia. Cambodia. Canton. Cantrill, Hadley. Capabilities, Psychological. Capacity, Own. Caribbean Pirates. Casablanca. Casey, Ralph D. Catholicism. Catlin, G. E. C. Censorship, Russian. Central Intelligence Agency. Central Intelligence Group. Central Pacific. Chandler, Douglas. Changes of Nations in Wartime. Chaika. Chiang Kai-shek. China. Central China, 1944. Communist China. Japanese garrisons in. Organization. Reorganized national government. OWIN. Protestant churches in. Revolution of 1927. Chungking government. China-Burma-India Theater. Forward Echelon Headquarters. China Theater. Chinese Communists, Dash. Chinese Federal Reserve Bank. Chinese prisoners. Chinese railway campaigns. Christmas cards. Churchill, Winston. Cinema. Civil Defense. Civil Information and Education Section. Civilians, Friendly. Clandestine Stations. Classification. Clausewitz, Karl von. Clay, Jen. Lucius D. Cleavage. Cleveland, Grover. Cold War. Description. In Asia. Nature. Origins. Outcome. Termination. Warfare within. Combined Chiefs of Staff. Command function. Commanders, American theaters. Commando. Commands, contingency. Commands, to enemy forces. Commissioner General for Southeast Asia. Committee for a Free Asia, FF. Committee for a Free Europe, FF. Common causes. Communist appeals. Communist goal. Communist-dominated governments. Communist manifesto. Communism. Communist Party. Communists. Confederate States. Confucianism. Conquest of probability. Consolidation company. Consolidation plans. Consolidation propaganda. Continental Congress. Contingency plans. Conversion. Process of. Conversionary propaganda. Coordination. Coordination of U.S. Facilities. Coordinator of information. Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. Cortez, Hernán. Counterespionage. Counterfeiting. Countermeasures to black. Counterpropaganda. Defensive. Instructions. Initiative. Countersubversion. Covert operations. In peacetime. Covert propaganda. Credenda. Creel Committee. Creel, George. Chrysal, Jose. Cromwell, Oliver. Crow, Karl. Czechoslovakia. Dalai Lama. Davidson, Philip. Davis, Elmer. Davis, Jefferson. D-Day. Decision-making, factors of. Defeat, psychological. Democratic. Desertion. Developmental research, FF. In-Psy War. Dien Bien Phu. Diplomacy. Dramatic intimidation. Directives. Distribution, artillery. District Information Services Control Commands. Donuts, ADM. Carl. Doihara, General Kenji. Dome Agency. Domestic Operations Branch. Donovan, General William J. Dub, Leonard W. Doolittle Flyers. Door Gods. Doriot, Jacques. Dunkirk. Dutch in Indonesia. East India Company. Economic Cooperation Administration. Ed and Joe. Education. Edwards, A. L. E.I. Surrender. 8th Army in Korea, Dash. Eisenhower, Gen. Dwight D. Ellis, Havelock. Enemy. Definition. Lifeline. Propaganda situation. England. Environmental stimuli. Espionage. Estimate of the situation. Estimates, written. European Defense Community. European Theater. Ezekiel, Mordecai. Fact. Slanting. Falsification, radio. Farrago, Ladislas. Fascismo. Fascist Italian Social Republic. Fascists. Federal Communications Commission. Phase, Herbert. Feldpostcart. Field maneuvers using Psy-War. Field manual. Field operations. 5th Army. Files, propaganda. Films. First Loudspeaker and Leaflet Company. First Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet Group. Assisting stations. Work in Far East Command. Fisher, Lewis. Fisher, F. M. Flensburg. Flexibility in Psy-War. Food appeals. Food propaganda. Force short of war. Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service. Foreign Information Service. Foreign Operations Administration. 4-Minute Men. 14 points. 14th Air Force. Fox, Ralph. France. As a future ally. Frederick the Great. Free India. Free India Army. French Foreign Office. French in Indochina. French Revolution. French Revolutionaries. Freud, Sigmund. Friedrich. Carl J. Friendship in Psy-War, FF. From, Eric. Führer. Future of Psy-War, FF. Fuses. Gemusho. Galahad Operation. Gallop, Dr. George. Gallop Pole. General Staff. Geneva. Geneva Convention. Genghis Khan. George III. German failure in Ukraine. German psychological warfare. Germany. Black operations. Imperial government. Naval radio. Pastoralization of. U.S. Zone. World War II accomplishments. Gideon. Gifts. Giles, Herbert A. Goals of Psy-War. Definition. Enemy goals. Specific propaganda goals. Goebbels, Paul Joseph. Gorer, Jeffrey. Gray, Gordon. Great Patriotic War. Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Green, Carlton. Green, Colonel J. Woodall. Grenades, Rifle. Grew, Joseph C. Guam. Guerrilla warfare. Guidance. Examples. Gurney, Sir Henry. Gustav Siegfried Eins. Guthrie, Edwin. Hague Convention. Hall, Colonel. Donald. Han. Han Military Emperor. Han River. Harvard College. Haushofer, General Carl. Haw, Lord. Hawaii. Headquarters and Headquarters Company. Hegelian Philosophy. Henry, George W. Herodotus. Hers, Major Martin. Hindustani. Hiroshima. Historical Materialism. Hitler, Adolf. Hitlerjugend. Hitlermadel. Ho Chi Minh. Holland. Holy Roman Empire. Homeland Facilities. Honesty as basis of U.S. policy. Howitzers. Hooks, Hukbong Mapagpalaya Bayan. Huns. Hunter, Edward. Hymn of Hate. Identification of propaganda. Identity cards. Ideology. And plans. India. Indian-Pakistani fighting. Indochina. Indo-Chinese War. Indonesia. Indonesia, fighting in. Indonesia, Republic of. Information activities of State Department. Information agencies, chart. Information control commands. Information control service. Information, Department of. Information and Education Section. Inner Mongolia. Inquisition. Insanity as a communist technique. Intelligence. Director of. Propanal in. Propaganda intelligence. Inter-allied cooperation. Interest, enemy. Interim Intelligence Information Service. International Information Service. International Propaganda. International Realities. Internationale. Interpretation versus. Truth. Interrogation. Of prisoners. Iron Curtain. Irregular warfare. Islam. Isolationism. Israel. Italy. Landings in. Surrender. Jackson, C.D. Jackson Report. Jackson, William. Jacobite Broadcast. Japan. Board of Information. Black Book. Black Propaganda. Cultural Propaganda. Emperor. Foreign Office. Nostalgic White. Peso Note. Psy War in World War II. Sad Sack. Surrender. Japan's East Asia. Jenks, Edward. Jisei. Johnson, Louis. Johnston, Colonel. Dana W. Joho Kyoku. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Joint Psychological Warfare Committee. Josie, Alex. Joyce, James. Joyce, William. See Ha Ha, Lord. Catchins. Kafka, Franz. Kaiserist Propaganda. Kaltenbach, Fred. Kempitai. Kinsey Reports. Kiska. Kjellin, Rudolph. Kessler, Arthur. Koop, Theodore. Korea. Korean Conflict, Dash. Leaflet Deliveries. Loudspeaker Sections. Opsearch. Propaganda Policies. Psy-War In. Psy-War Officers. Radio Operations. Radio Propaganda. Krum. Kublai Khan. Kultur. Kuomintang. Kais, Roger M. Labor Recruitment. Lamb, Harold. Laos. Larson, Cedric. Laswell, Harold. Latin America. Lattimore, Owen. Laurel, Jose P. Laval, Pierre. Leadership, Defamation of. Leaflets. Action leaflets. Anti-exhibit leaflet. Anti-radio leaflet. Artillery, delivery by. B-29 raids. On Berlin. Bombs. Bundles. Bunker Hill leaflet. Civilian action leaflets. Civilian morale leaflet. For civilians. Direct reply leaflet. Dispensers. Distribution. Dropping procedures. Field procedure. French Communist leaflet. Ground distributed leaflets. Informational leaflet. Loading. Map leaflets. Morale leaflets. News leaflets. Packaged leaflets. Philippine leaflet. Production. Radio program leaflet. Rolling. Spot news leaflets. Start of war leaflet. Surrender leaflets. Surrender leaflet, AEF. Surrender leaflet, improved. Surrender form, radio. Surrender, tactical, leaflets. Troop morale leaflet. Troop morale leaflet, gray. Troop morale leaflet, Nazi. World War I leaflets. Legion of St. George. Leighton, Lieutenant Com. Alexander. Lades, Nathan. Lenin, Nikolai, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Lenin Old Guard. Leninism. Letters, prisoner. Lewis, Wyndham. Leyte Campaign. Lessa. Liaison. Field Liaison. Mechanics of. Liaison Officers, Psy-War. Library of Congress. Lienta University. Limitations on American Psy-War, FF. Lippmann, Walter. Listening, Prevention of. Literary Personalities in Propaganda. Lo Quan Chung. Localism. Long, Huey. Loria. Loudspeaker units. Loudspeakers. Airborne. Emplacement. Vehicle mounted. Luftpost. Luxembourg. MacArthur, Jen. Douglas. MacDonald, Malcolm. Mackle, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel T. McLeish, Archibald. Maginot Line. Magsaysay, Ramon. Males. Civilian personnel. Malay. Malaya. Chinese in, ff. Government of. High Commissioner of. War in. Malayan Races Liberation Army. Malingerers Black. Manchukuo. Manchus in China. Mannheim, Karl. Mao Zedong. Marx, Karl. Marxism. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Materials. Basic materials. Enemy information materials. McClure, Jen. Robert B. McAvoy, Dennis. Media. Limitations. Prescription of. Medical conditions. Mediterranean Theater. Mein Kampf. Marat, Edward K. Merriam, Charles E. Merrill's Marauders. Mexican War. Mexico. Midianites. Mihailovich, Draja. Military goals. Military Intelligence Division. Military Intelligence Reserve. Military Intelligence Service. Military Propaganda School. Military Psy-War since World War II, ff. Military Secretary. Milton, George Fort. Milton, John. Ministry of Information. Miranda. Mission. Sense of. Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company. Mock, James R. Mockery. Money. Mongol Secret Weapons. Monitor, Submarine. Monitoring. Morale. Analysis Chart. Enemy Situation. General Morale. German Morale. Index. Operations. Services. Wartime Morale. Morgan, Dr. George. Mortars. Moscow. Moscow Peking Axis. Moscow Trials. Motion Pictures. American. Propaganda Movies. Motive. Attribution of. Movie van. Mutiny. Mutual Security Administration. Nagasaki. National Level Plans. National Security Council. National Socialist German Workers' Party. See Nazism. National War Aims Commission. Nationalism and Communism. Nationalists, Chinese. Nazism. And Communism. Fifth column. Nazi-Soviet struggle. Netherlands and Indonesia. New British Broadcasting Company. New Democracy. New York, radio facilities. News. As intelligence. Bad news. Classified news. Commercial facilities. Good news. Palatability. Planted news. Pre-action news. Private facilities. Procurement of. Sources. Newspapers. Air format newspapers. Airborne newspapers. In American Revolution. Nikolai, Colonel. Walther. Nimitz, Admiral Chester W. 19 Corps. Normalcy, effects. Normandy. North Africa. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Burma. North Korea. Communist Army of. Northrop, FSC. Norway. Nostalgic Black. Nostalgic White. Novelty Materials. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Obscene Black. Estrus Black. Estrus Gray. Offensive Propaganda. Office of Censorship. Office of Chief of Psy-War. Office of Facts and Figures. Office of Intelligence, Information, and Cultural Affairs. Office of Inter-American Affairs. Office of Strategic Services. In SWPA. Office of War Information. Organization. Outposts. Quarrels with OSS. Okinawa. Operations, clandestine. Operations Coordination Board, FF. Functions and members. Operations Division, GS. Operations Research, FF. Operators. Needs. Qualifications of. Opinion. Analysis. Enemy opinion. Enemy opinion profile. Generalized opinion. Opinion groups. Sampling. Order of battle. Outer Mongolia. Outpost Service Bureau. Overclassification. Overseas offices. Overseas Operations Branch. Overt Act. Overt Propaganda. Payne. Thomas. Palestine. Palmerston, Lord, Henry John Temple, 3D Viscount. Pamphlets. Panmunjom. Parachute News. C. Rakissan. Pareto, Wilfredo. Parsons, Talcott. Passierschein. Pavlovian Psychology. Pearl Harbor. Peasant Revolts. Peck, Graham. Percentage Analyses. Pershing's Headquarters. Persians. Personnel Limitations. Persuasion. Phase Planning. Philippines. Communist War in. Philosophy and Propaganda Development. Photo Exhibit. Pictures, Prisoners. PK Units. Plainclothes Troops. Planning. Enemy Plans and Situations. Failure of West. General Plans. In Research and Development, FF. Pre-belligerent Planning. Point 4 Administration. Poland. Policy Meetings. Political Advisor. Political Background. Political Goals. Political Limitations. Political Officers. Political Warfare. In Indochina. Political Warfare Executive. Politics, Home Front. Polyplanes. Polo, Marco. Postal Propaganda. Poster Propaganda. Pre-belligerent Stages. President's Committee on International Information. Activities. Press Analysis. Presses, Military. Price, Byron. Printing. Prisoners of War. Propaganda Value. Private use of Psy-war techniques. Problems, Future Tactical. Projection in Propaganda. Promises. Propaganda. Analysis. Analysis Procedure. Choice in. Commitment. Conditions for Effectiveness. Defensive Propaganda. Divisive Propaganda. History of. Organizations, National. Propaganda Addict. Propaganda against Propaganda. Purposefulness in. Reuse of. In 7 Small Wars. Propaganda Branch. Propaganda Man. Propaganda Platoon. Propaganda Section, AEF. Propaganda Company. Propagandists as spokesman. Propanel. See Propaganda Analysis. Proust, Marcel. Prussia. Psychological Research in Psy-war. Psychological Strategy Board. Psychological Warfare. American Agencies. Definitions. Defensive. In Intelligence, G2. Limitations. In Military Government. Nazi Psy-war. New Establishment in Army. Organization 4. Personnel. In Plans and Operations, G3. Policy, Dissension over. Tactical Planning. Training, FF. Psychological Warfare Board. Psychological Warfare Branch. Psychological Warfare Center. Psychological Warfare Division, SHAF. Psychological Warfare Facility. Psychological Warfare School. Psychological Warfare Section. Psychological Warfare Staff in FEC. Psychologist, role of. Psychology. New developments. Relation to propaganda. Psychology Section, AEF. Public Affairs, Assistant Secretary of State for. Public Affairs Officer. Public Opinion Quarterly. Public Relations. Publications Platoon. Pashtu. Quakers. Quality as opposed to quantity in Psy-War. Quantification. Quasi-private operations, FF. Quisling, Vidkin. Quislings. Quotations, falsified. Rodek, Carl. Radio. American operations. Jamming. Materials. Shortwave. Standard wave relay. Support. Suppression. Tactical radio. Wired radio. Radio Broadcasting and Leaflet Group. Radio Free Asia, FF. Radio Free Europe, FF. Radio in the American Sector. Radio Luxembourg. Radio Malaya. Radio Saipan. Radio Tokyo. Radio War. Raids, B-29. Rakuten News. Rand Corporation. Ration Cards. Reader's Digest. Readiness, National. Rearrangements in U.S. Government. Recognition and Delay, FF. Recruiting of anti-communist forces. Red Army. Red Scare. Reformation, Wars of the Religious Black. Reproduction Company. Requirements, Guidance. Research and Analysis Branch. Reserve Groups. Use in Psy-War. Responsibility of Propagandists. Reston, James. Results of Psy-War. Revision of U.S. Laws. Revolution and Development of International Relations. Project. Revolution as opposed to living. Revolutionary Propaganda. Rockefeller Office. Rockets. Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roper, Elmo. Rowe, David. Royal, Kenneth C. Rum, Romanism and Rebellion. Rumors, Mongol. Russian Army of Liberation. Russian Combat Propaganda. Russian Revolution. Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. Ryukyus. C. Okinawa. Sabine, G. H. Saipan. Salesmanship. Samuel, Czar. San Francisco. OWIN. Radio Facilities. San Qua. Sargent, Howland. Saumaise, Claude de. Scandinavia. Schenk, Wolf. Secret Weapons. Security. Excessive Security. Security Liaison. Limitations. Security Officers. Procedures. Supervision. Unit Security. Selling, Lowell S. Sex Propaganda. Shafe. Shans. Shantung Guerrillas. Shells. Artillery. Chemical Warfare. Leaflet Shells. Smoke Shells. Sherwood, Robert. Shonan. Siam. Sicherheitsdienst. Singapore. Small Wars, 7. Smearing. Smith. Bruce Lawns. Smith, Nickel. Smith, Walter Bedell. Social Groups. Social Sciences in Psy-War. Socialists, Russian. Solbert, Jen. Oscar N. Source. Southeast Asia. Southwest Pacific. Soviet-German Front. Soviet Propaganda, 1941–45. Development of Techniques. Soviet Psy-War. Soviet Union. Policies. Spain. Spanish Empire. Special Study Group. Specificity in Propaganda. Stab in the back. Staff functions. Stalin, Joseph. Stanford University. Stanley, L.T. Colonel John B. Stasm, Formula, Dash. Stassen, Harold E. State Department. State War Navy Coordinating Committee. Statistical Propanel. Stein, Gertrude. Sturber, Der. Stewart, James. Stilwell, General Joseph W. Stoddard, Lothrop. Strafe. Strategic Operations in International Information. Strategic Plans. Strategic Propaganda. Strategic Propaganda Unit. Stribert, Theodore C. Strengths of U.S. Propaganda, FF. Subject. Submarine Operations. Subversive Material, Black. Subversive Operations. Subversive Operations Units. Sultan, General Daniel I. Sung Dynasty. Sun Tzu. Sun Yat-senism. Supreme Commander for Allied Powers. Surprise Attacks. Surrender. Goal of Psy-War. Procedure. Surrender Passes. Psychology of Switzerland. Simeon. Tactical Information Detachment. Tactical Propaganda. Tactical Propaganda Unit. Target, Leaflet. Tartars. Totters. Taylor, Edmund. Taylor, George. Technical Cooperation Administration. Technical Manual. Thielhet, Darwin. Temps, Lo. Tension. Causes. Indecision-making. In War, FF. Research on, FF. Terrain of Propaganda. Terror, Strategy of. Tudoberger Wald. Theater Psychological Warfare. Theater Psychological Warfare Officer. Thompson, Dorothy. Thompson, Colonel. Charles A. H. Tibet. Time. Time Life Fortune. Timeliness. Timing. Tito. C. Bras Tito. Toilet Training. Tokugawa Shoguns. Total War and Constitutional Law. Totalitarian Parties. Toynbee, Arnold J. Traitors. Troop Indoctrination. Trotsky, Leon. Truth. Turkish Psy-War. Ukraine, FF. Unconditional Surrender, Doctrine. Unconscious Mind. Undercover Organizations. Underground Railway. Understanding of the Enemy. Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. United Nations Command in Korea. United Service Organizations. United States Information Agency. Director of United States Information Service. Use of all government activities in Psy-War. Uses of Psy-War. Utley, Frida. Vegetius. Venezia Giulia. Victory and Defeat, Alternatives to Victory, Psychological. Viereck, George S. Viet Minh. Viet Minh vs. Vietnam, FF. Vietnam. Vladimirtsev, B. Vlasov, General André A. Voice of America. Voice of the United Nations Command. Voices, Ghost. Voices, Amplified. Voke. Vorwärts. Vozd. Vyshinsky, André. Wallace, Henry A. Wang and Shi. Wang Qingwei. Wang Mang. War. As chronic state. Concepts of. Definition. Between dissimilar states. Force short of war. Between similar states. War College. War Department participation. War Propaganda Bureau. Warburg, James P. Warfare psychologically waged, dash. Wartime skills, use of in peace. Washburn, Abbott. Washington, George. Washington Theater Liaison. Watts, Richard, Jr. Weapons. Leaflet discharging. Mongol secret weapons. Weber, Max. Wiedemeyer, Jen. Albert C. West Germany. White House assistant in charge of informational policies. White propaganda. Uyghur, Leon. William Jackson Report. William of Orange. Wichet Watakan. Women. Working Class Revolution. World Revolution. World War I. Yamato Damashii. Yan'an. Yuan Shikai. Zacharias, ADM. Ellis. Zilborg, Gregory. Zionist Organization. Also by Paul M. A. Linebarger. The Political Doctrines of Sun Yat-sen. Baltimore, Johns Hopkins Press, 1937. Government in Republican China. New York, McGraw-Hill Book Company, 1938. The China of Chiang Kai-shek. Boston, World Peace Foundation. 1941. A Syllabus of Psychological Warfare. Washington, War Department General Staff, 1946. Psychological Warfare in ROTC Senior Manual. Harrisburg, Military Service Publishing Company. 1948. Far Eastern Governments and Politics. With Jiang Chu and Ardath Burks. New York, D. Van Nostrand Company, 1954. Transcriber's Notes. The following changes have been made. In the context of the unprofessional guttersnipe Hitler was ruining the wonderful German army in amateurish campaigns, stood reigning instead of ruining. The list of further works by the same author was moved from the beginning to the end of the book. In the index, the reference for the entry, Indonesia, fighting in, was changed from 257 to 258 to 257 to 259, and reference for the entry results of Psywar, from 327 to 307. Retained error, while the list of charts mentions a chart X, no such chart was contained in the book. The entry has been retained, though.